忏悔。感恩山是佛的狮子吼，祈愿一切众生皆能具足因缘和能力，闻师说法，因机醒悟，恒依佛智，念念觉悟，事事觉悟，时时觉悟，处处觉悟。是愿尽未来际与上师三宝的善因缘，如同真如自性，永恒清净自在，坚固不坏。与诸佛及佛所认可的善知识，善因缘如同真如自性，永恒清净自在，坚固不坏。感恩善是佛的慈悲摄受，感恩所有善因缘没有舍弃我。水中捞月万万年，生生世世追逐那虚无缥缈，劳民伤财，耗神费力，苦乐无常，颠倒无尽，没意思。惭愧忏悔，一代一切众生惭愧忏悔，犯病了还不自知的无明愚痴，祈愿一切众生皆能闻师说法，因机醒悟。但坚决誓愿具足因缘和能力，速证如所如说，随教而行。于诸和尚阿舍雷所，尚能感恩欢喜的恭敬供养尊重赞叹，随教而行，出舍强慢速述教诲。于正法真生起要想，于和尚阿舍雷所生起佛想，于自身所起病人想，于说法者起名医想。为积佛法不爱生命，于诸财物衣钵之余起老结想，施事医丸法师药，但这个病人坚决誓愿感恩欢喜的赠医嘱服药，远程离垢得法眼镜，托念力福福归元真，发本名药，摩尼宝珠随意现，逍遥自在为法王。愿此誓愿等真如具足极大的欢喜信心。大眼猛精精力，不乱专一的念，固定成自己的一部分，生成智慧，巧妙巧正生根基。你好，印一师傅，我们昨天把这个强迫症这个页面探究完了，然后呢，这个因为几天都是在学一个页面一个概念，然后我们日常生活还在过，然后呢，我们日常生活中天天也都在发生的一些事情，比如说我们吃啊，然后我们今天哦。
At Woolworths, we can help you spend less today on first days and
Sorry，我还没有分享屏幕。好，先开始哈。今天我们学习一下博格医生这边教我们的一些与我们生活息息相关的一些日常的常识吧。就是这个油，我们天天都要吃饭，天天都要做菜，然后天天都在接触油我们学习一下这个油到底哪些对我们有害，哪些对我们有帮助。先开始哈。
with prices dropped for spring on Australian sweet Solanato tomatoes 200 grams or Cutes baby cucumbers 250 grams to just $3 a pack. That's today's fresh food, people.
Today, UBA has been the target of a cyber attack. What secrets come out?
Maybe a miracle. I'm offering you a lifetime. I was at the grocery store the other day. Trying to find some food, right? Sometimes it's hard to find actual real food at the grocery store. So I'm going through and I just had this thought in my mind. If we were to look at this grocery store from the viewpoint of what percent of all these foods have sugar, okay, pretty high. Is sugar really the bad thing? Or is it maybe the refined carbs or the starches? Or maybe it's the seed oils, right? High in omega-6. But today I'm going to kind of discuss different types of foods in relationship to how bad they are. Because a lot of times you are in certain environments like grocery stores and you have to eat something. So what would be better than others, right? Kind of focus more on differentiating sugar versus these omega-6 seed oils, okay? So before I begin, I just want to have you comment down in the section below. What do you think is worse, consuming sugar or seed oils? And I'm talking about the soy oil, the corn oil, the canola, the cottonseed oil, the safflower, the sunflower oil. I've done a ton of videos on sugar and how bad it is, and it creates diabetes, etc. And I've also done quite a few videos on omega-6 fatty acids and the importance of getting your ratios of omega-6 to omega-3. Ideally, I mean, like 1-to-1 would be awesome if you can go for that. On average, we're consuming way too much omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids. I think it's like we're consuming like 25 times more omega-6 than we should in our diets. Yes, people will say that we need them, they're essential, but we don't need as many, and we definitely don't need the type of omega-6 that we're being fed. But an average person, as far as looking at the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, like a 15-to-1 ratio. Okay, that's the average person in the US. Now that's very, very conservative. It's probably a lot more, like 30, 40, 50, 60, I don't know, but it's high. It needs to be 1-to-1. These oils, these fats, okay, they're called polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're kind of like building blocks for body tissue, especially structural things in our cell membranes, in our brain. And when we have this imbalance, we get all sorts of problems, especially in the cell membrane. When you consume sugar, and I'm talking about refined sugar, like from candy, added sugars and ice cream and things like that, they also create some bad effects. They don't tend to go and lodge into our cells like the oils, but they combine with proteins and they kind of alter the protein, and that's called glycation, which it makes this protein unavailable. That extra sugar doesn't tend to accumulate other than being converted to fat like the omega-6 fatty acids do. So if we just compare one aspect of accumulation in the body, when we take a look at omega-6 or seed oils, industrial seed oils versus sugar, industrial seed oils will accumulate in your tissues. They make up your tissues for a very long time, like 600 days. Okay, so that's the problem. They're not water soluble like sugar is. They tend to accumulate in the tissues. Now, sugar can be burned off. Okay? When you exercise, you can burn off this excess sugar. Now, there's some other points that I want to mention. Do these refined oils deplete you of certain nutrients? They can, especially the fat-soluble nutrients. Okay, but what about the sugar? Does that deplete any nutrients? I'm talking about refined sugar. The answer is a big fat yes, it does. It depletes your B1 big time. The more sugar you consume, the more B1 that is needed to metabolize that sugar. If you're eating a lot of sugar, you're going to deplete your B1. You're going to have a lot of symptoms of a B1 deficiency. So we have B1, calcium, magnesium. We have deficiency of zinc, vitamin C. The chemistry of vitamin C versus glucose is very, very similar. So if you're consuming glucose, sugar, same time with vitamin C, it's going to compete. So the body's going to pull in the sugar and avoid pulling in the vitamin C. And so if a person consumes a lot of sugar, especially through the day, they have a lot of gum problems, right? They're going to start showing signs of kind of a subclinical scurvy, which is you have bleeding gums, fatigue. They brush their teeth and the toothbrush is red because it's destroying the vascularization and making the blood vessels very, very weak, like the connective tissue. That's not happening just in your gums. It's happening throughout the entire body. So refined sugar does deplete vitamins. But what about fruit? Okay. Well, fruit has sugar, but it also has these vitamins. So chances are it's not going to deplete any of these vitamins. So that's a plus point for fruit. So if you were to evaluate the sugar in fruit versus refined sugar, of course, refined sugar is much, much worse. Plus, the complications or the side effects from this refined sugar can be countered or lessened greatly if you have phytonutrients. So this is why fruit is much, much better than refined sugar, because it has all the phytonutrients that can protect you from the complications from diabetes. It's very highly likely that you would ever develop diabetes from consuming fruit. The reason I don't recommend consuming fruit is just that there's too much sugar and it bumps you out of ketosis. But anytime you're eating anything in the whole form, okay, there's protective factors in this whole form, whether it's a starch or a fruit. Now, with these seed oils, wow, you're getting a highly refined, overprocessed part of a seed, which is the oil part, but nothing else. You're not getting the phytonutrients to protect you against the oxidation that oil is going to create on your body, especially with your like LDL. You're going to oxidate your LDL. That's going to affect the inside of the arteries. I mean, it's going to create inflammation. It's going to pull things out of your body. And also, how do you think that they extract this oil from the seed? They use a solvent. It's called hexane. Okay, is it possible that some of that hexane is still in that oil, or does it magically go away? So you take this seed and you turn it into this oil with all these things that you do to it, and then you put it on the shelves as vegetable oil, right? Sounds really healthy, but it's really not. But the amount of this oil in our diet is just tremendous. And unfortunately, all this came from this huge push to replace the saturated fats with the unsaturated fats, okay? That's really why it's in our grocery stores in abundance, right? And you might say, well, we don't consume any of that oil. But what about your salad dressing? Have you ever tried to buy salad dressing without some of these seed oils? What about in hummus? They replaced it with soy oil and canola oil and even safflower oil or sunflower oil. So we have all the condiments, mayonnaise, especially soy oil. We have the salad dressings, and then we have the restaurant foods, right? I mean, wow. I mean, try to get some food they don't use these seed oils to fry something or cook something with at a restaurant, especially if you consume anything fried at the restaurant. Those apples loaded with omega-6 fatty acids, right? You might not make the connection, but I mean, just see how you feel the day after you go to a restaurant, right? You might feel bloated, kind of thick in your gut, probably because of those oils. Now, I'm not even going to go down the path of talking about like a fast food restaurant or consuming French fries or some of these obvious forms of deep fried foods using mega amounts of corn or soy oil under this condition where there's extreme high heat. And how many times do they use that same oil over and over and over again? I heard it's like weeks and months before they change the oil. But all of that oil is going to lodge into our membranes. At least with sugar, you can go and exercise and burn it off. Now, there's going to be deficiencies, so you'd want to take these vitamins back into the body, but I just recommend avoiding them. I mean, let's take a long-distance runner, right? And they consume this little glucose gel pack, right? Glucose or maltodextrin, right? It's going to deplete a lot of nutrients. They're going to burn off this energy for sure, but they're going to also end up with low blood sugar symptoms. They're going to end up with deficiencies, the type of deficiencies that you don't want if you're an athlete, right? Vitamin B1, vitamin C, zinc, magnesium. You don't want those if you're running long distances. I mean, you need that B1 to handle the lactic acid byproduct of the glucose metabolism. So you might end up with a lot of sore muscles and a lot of other issues, like even lactic acidosis, which it's like affects your breathing. Now, at the restaurants, if you ever want to know where to find the majority of these omega-6, just look at the kids menu, right? The deep fried foods. They have the French fries, of course, the deep fried hush puppies, the mac and cheese, all these highly processed foods with just a ton of omega-6 fatty acids. If we just look at these two omega-6 seed oils and sugars, omega-6 fatty acids are much, much worse than the sugars. Now, the other really important point to know is that the ratios of omega-6 to omega-3, they should be 1 to 1. Like I said before, an average person has at least 25 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. So this is so far out of whack. So another hidden source of this is the grains that are fed to animals. So when you're consuming the conventional grain-fed beef or the grain-fed chickens, which produce the eggs would be like, if we're talking about omega-6, like 19.9 to 1 omega-3. So heavy on the omega-6. But if we look at the free range, non-GMO, non-soy fed chickens that produce these eggs, we get like a much better ratio, like a 1.3 omega-6 to a 1 omega-3. And they're discovering all sorts of things that can also improve this ratio. If a chicken is fed fish meal, which is higher in omega-3, okay, it may be some flax oil, which has a precursor to omega-3. then that ratio comes way down to like a 6.6 to a 1 ratio, okay, which is much better, down even to a 1-to-1 ratio. So it really depends on what they feed these chickens. But if you're looking for chicken eggs, I would really go for the pasture-raised organic eggs, okay, not pasteurized, pasture-raised. And then, of course, you get the beef, right? You have the grain-fed beef versus the grass-fed, grass-finished beef. I've done videos on this and also a study that is quite amazing, showing the difference between beef from a grass-fed or a grain-fed diet. And there is a huge difference. Typically, grain-fed beef is like 9-to-1, 9 omega-6 to 1 omega-3, okay? Whereas grass-fed beef is like 2-to-1. Now, when I submitted my beef from my farm into this study, mine was like closer to like a 1 point, I think it was 1.1-to-1 ratio. So it's actually even better than most of the other farmers, simply because my cows don't ever get the option to consume any grain at all. Because a lot of times, even if something is grass-fed, they can also be grain finished. There should be more transparency with what you're really getting. And I think going in the future, you're going to see that more and more. Because I want to know if I'm spending more money for grass-fed, I want to know it's truly grass-fed. Now, what about other things like nuts? Okay, nuts are high in omega-6, but nuts are also high in these phytonutrients that can also balance out all the complications from the omega-6. Versus those refined oils, there's no other anything in there that can counter all that oxidation. So even though nuts are high in omega-6, they're not nearly as bad. So again, we have to look at the whole picture to evaluate levels of how bad a food is versus something else. Now, if we refine that nut into like almond flour, for example, now we've gotten rid of some of these protective factors. So if you take these grains, right, and you turn them into flour, even if they're whole grains, you're still going to oxidize them, expose them to air, and you're going to lose a lot of the nutrients. So even though something is whole grain, okay, less refined, it's still a problem because it's refined. Other key point relating to these omega-6 fatty acids has to do with the competitive nature between an omega-6 and omega-3 fat. Okay, they do tend to compete. So if you're consuming a lot more omega-3 fatty acids from fish oils or cod liver oil, which you should be doing, and at the same time you're consuming a lot of the omega-6, they're going to kind of cancel each other out. So you do need to reduce the 6 and increase the omega-3. I think the best way to do that is by doing the cod liver oil, because it's a little bit better than the fish oils, even though you can do the fish oils.
We can take charge of our home loan, adjust it with speed.
Apply online in minutes. It's as simple as can be. It's never been easier to apply for Australia's #1 home loan for all the ways we can.
Cod liver oil also has some additional things in it, like vitamin A and vitamin D. And then as far as these other oils, like cooking oils, you should use like butter or ghee, coconut oil, lard, tallow, extra virgin olive oil. It's very important to have those oils as your cooking oils. Now, there's one last point I want to bring up, doing a major deep dive into DNA. And I've been looking at quite a few reports. And out of all the things that show up as a common denominator, it's these polyunsaturated fatty acids, okay? They keep showing up as an alteration in our genes. Now, what do I mean alteration in our genes? It means that our body has a great difficulty in converting the precursors like the ALA into the DHA, or the EPA in DHA, which is the omega-3 fatty acids. So we have a hard time converting them. Okay, so if you're eating walnuts or flaxseed, things like that, you're not going to convert them as easily. On top of that, you're going to have a hard time absorbing some of the omega-3 fatty acids. So this is just another reason why these omega-3 fatty acids are so important to fish oils, or even eating wild caught fish, having that in our diets, or even sardines. Huge. As you can see, if we compare these two things, omega-6 seed oils and industrial seed oils are much, much worse than sugar. At least with sugar, you can exercise and burn it off. You can take phytonutrients, you can take vitamins to replace the ones that are missing. And of course, the phytonutrients can protect you even if you have high levels of sugar in your bloodstream because you're a diabetic. So I just wanted to make this important distinction because you can't give everything the same importance as far as how bad it is. There are certain things that are much worse than others. Now, if you have not seen my video on the results of the study I was involved with comparing grain-fed beef to grass-fed beef, you should check that out. It's pretty interesting. I put that video up right here.
OK，清灯实行。这里，因为我们上次说到过油的时候，你说你们家加花生油嘛，那从头到尾他没有提到花生油，他没有把它列在那个欧米伽6很高的里面。然后呢，他在提那个我们要吃，就说我们日常生活中我们到底吃哪些油呢？他就说到了，你看一个是什么？奶油，然后那个酥油，然后酥油是什么？酥油是不是从牛奶里面提炼出来的？酥油也是牛奶里面提炼出来的油吗？然后是那个橄榄油，他说粗糙的橄榄油，然后还有猪油，他也是说到猪油可以当食用油来，它是不是那个耐高温还是怎样？那我们其他的整油，比如说葵花籽油了，特别是大豆油里面的欧米伽6非常的多。然后就是说，如果是说你既有欧米伽3又欧米伽6的话，两个会相互抵消。然后那个欧米伽6会让我们身体发炎的、腹胀的。他说有的时候我们腹胀是因为我们吃的是欧米伽6所以这里今天提到的几个关键的点就是糖，然后精致碳水跟欧米伽6这3个我们是天天都在接触的。一个是糖呢，他说不会进入到细胞里面，然后但是呢，它会破坏蛋白质，所以就是我们一旦糖在身体里面多了的时候，容易形成那个糖尿病呢，就是因为那个蛋白质它会破坏蛋白质，让我们不能吸收蛋白质吧这是糖尿病。然后呢果糖里面那些呢，果糖如果是水果里面的糖呢，比较下来你直接吃糖跟吃水果里面的糖呢，那比较下来水果里面的糖会更好一点，就是一个一个比较但是他还是不建议吃那么多了第二个就是说糖跟油比较，这两个哪个更有害我们的身体呢？那糖它会很快就会代谢掉了我们用一些其他的食物就能把它抵消掉。然后油我们吃进去的那个欧米伽6的那种油呢，它在身体里面如果是存在那里的话，他说它最少要存个600天呢。然后呢，那个欧米伽6在我们身体里面很容易引起发炎的。你看它的比例，欧米伽3跟欧米伽6在我们身体里面比例正常只能是1:1，然后我们现在多到了几十倍，就是说那个欧米伽6跟欧米伽3的那个比例是几十倍了，所以我们身体造成很多的炎症腹胀好多都这样。然后呢，那看哪些油？你看后面就是说到那个精致碳水，因为精致碳水这些的话呢，它上面说到精致碳水，它最后它也是转化成糖精致碳水。但是今天它最主要说油，然后我们吃什么的油呢？它一个建议就看到了，奶油、酥油，然后是橄榄油、猪油，那这是他点到的。我们如果是我们可以用那几个油，就尽量用这些油吧，这个可以让我们身体少发炎的。好，那上次跟你说到氢能实行，就说你说你们家是用花生油嘛？那这里它没有，从头到尾它没有说花生油，它没有把它定义在这个可以做，就说因为我们中国人有很多花生油，用花生油来做食物嘛，然后它这里没有说到 他们也没有提它是在欧米伽6这一块，还是说是在可以食用的油里面。整个过程里面，它没有提花生油。好，我们再看一下代谢，就是有的时候我们的代谢功能
Today I'd
差
like to
也会引
discuss
起很多疾
the
病。
myth
我们再学习一下。
metabolic syndrome. We call it syndrome X. And that's a combination of several conditions. Central abdominal fat, blood pressure, glucose levels are starting to go up. We have high triglycerides. Today I'd like to discuss the myth around metabolic syndrome. They call it syndrome X. And that's a combination of several conditions. Central abdominal fat, blood pressure, glucose levels are starting to go up. We have high triglycerides with insulin resistance for sure. And also we have higher levels of insulin in the blood. It's called hyperinsulinemia, an association with an increased amount of uric acid. So we automatically associate metabolic syndrome with something really, really bad. It's a disease that you get, and doctors are going to put you on a lot of medications. There's going to be a lot of testing, and it's very complex, and no one really knows what causes it. But today I'm going to give you a completely new viewpoint on metabolic syndrome as it relates to a type of sugar called fructose. Now, what I believe metabolic syndrome really is, it's a protective mechanism. Now, if we look at our history as a hunter-gatherer down the evolutionary trail, humans did eat fruit and they did eat honey, not very often, which has a really good amount of fructose, okay? So I want to just talk about fructose for a second. It's a unique type of sugar. And when you consume glucose, there's receptors all over your body can metabolize glucose. But fructose is different. The liver is really the only place where your body can metabolize fructose. And there's some very unique things about fructose that relate to this topic that I'm going to talk about. For one, it's a lot more lipogenic, which means that it produces more fat than other types of sugar. Also, fructose enhances the fat genes much more than glucose and other sugars. If you just think about fructose for a minute, and what would be the survival benefit of consuming some fructose? You know, infrequently in the past, as we're trying to survive in our environment, food did not come very easily. And anytime that you had some fruit or honey, it was a survival thing. And so this really aligns with what fructose does in the body. Number one, it retains sodium. Now, what would be the survival mechanism for that? Well, way back in time, we did not have a lot of salt available in our diets. We had animal meat, there were some plants, we pretty much ate anything we could. And apparently, if we look at some interesting differences between way back then and now, we ate a lot less salt back then, or sodium, because it just wasn't available. And so sodium does help retain fluid and water and prevents dehydration. And so one thing that fructose does is it helps you retain sodium and sodium chloride salt, which connects to sodium. So way back then when we had fruit and honey, we could retain more fluid and prevent dehydration. In fact, fructose stimulates this hormone called vasopressin, which is called the antidiuretic hormone. So it prevents the loss of fluid from the body. It helps you retain fluid. So this is a survival mechanism. Now, if we take a look at what else we did way back then compared to now, we consumed a lot more potassium from just vegetation, plants, things like that. Compared to now, the average person consumes about 1.5 cups of vegetables. So that doesn't give us much potassium. So nowadays we have a lot of sodium and very low amounts of potassium. Very different from in the past. Another interesting thing about fructose is it causes sodium sensitivity. What's the advantage of that, survival-wise? Well, if you can make sodium more sensitive, you can absorb it more, it goes in your body, it can be retained more. And another benefit of holding this sodium is to help you increase blood pressure. Because one of the really important things in the past was you don't want to end up with low blood pressure because you don't have enough sodium, because we need to maintain the same amount of pressure to push the nutrients and the oxygen throughout our body, including our brain. Next thing is abdominal obesity. What would be the survival mechanism of that? Well, we're storing fuel for another day. That's what fat is. It's a survival mechanism. And we have a lot of extra space in our bellies, right? It's almost an unlimited amount of space. Well, it's not completely unlimited, but you can store a tremendous amount of stored energy in your midsection. So that would be a survival mechanism during lean times. Now, of course, nowadays, we consume a bit more fructose than we did in the past, right? I mean, fruits are available 24/7, every day of the year. Honey is also available, and also other types of fructose in the form of high fructose corn syrup. We're actually drinking the fructose now. I mean, even table sugar is like 50% fructose. So fructose is pretty much everywhere. Now, what about this other thing with insulin resistance? Is there any survival mechanism with that? There sure is. Number one, insulin resistance helps protect against the toxicity of glucose because it makes receptors for insulin very resistant, so you can't absorb as much glucose into the cell. Because if there's too much glucose, that's going to be toxic, and it's a way to protect you against both glucose and insulin. And along with insulin resistance, there's another thing that happens that helps you survive, and that's called gluconeogenesis. It's production of new sugar that doesn't involve a carbohydrate. So when people are pre-diabetic and they have insulin resistance, they actually make more glucose. Okay, but it's not coming from the diet. It's just their liver is just making more glucose from other sources. And this is behind the dawn phenomena. This is where you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you have high blood glucose, but maybe you didn't have any glucose the night before. It just means that you have insulin resistance and the liver makes more glucose because of it. And this is what you see in diabetes as well. You have a diabetic with high blood glucose, a certain portion of that is not coming from the sugar they're eating. It's coming from the liver producing a lot of sugar. What is the survival mechanism of gluconeogenesis? Well, number one, it helps you protect against hypoglycemia because your brain depends partially on glucose, which can be made by your body. And in times when there's not a lot of glucose available, this extra added gluconeogenesis can help the brain during survival modes. But of course, nowadays it's gotten out of control, right? Because we're having way too much sugar and we have way too much gluconeogenesis. Now, the next point I want to bring up is uric acid. You probably already know that when you consume fructose, you spike your uric acid. Now, what is the connection survival-wise with uric acid? Well, number one, it's a potent antioxidant, okay? So from that viewpoint,
Should I? With great flavor and 50% less fat, it's easy to say, oh yes. Go on. Say yes to Smith's Oven Baked.
it protects you against oxidation. Oxidation of what? Well, fructose, which is a type of sugar that kind of oxidizes the inside of the arteries, and it creates a lot of damage unless there's some protective factors that are connected to it, one being uric acid. But uric acid is a good predictor of high blood pressure and heart disease. So uric acid tends to increase blood pressure. What's the survival mechanism of that? Well, like I said before, when you don't have enough sodium, okay, we're going to end up with low blood pressure, and that is not a good survival mix. So the uric acid comes in there to help increase the blood pressure under conditions of low sodium. Okay, so in the past, uric acid was one way to raise the blood pressure. Of course, nowadays, when you have a lot of fructose and a lot of salt, that creates a huge problem with uric acid, very pathogenic. Uric acid also directly makes salt more sensitive. Nowadays, when someone's salt sensitive, we tell people to restrict their salt. But what they really should do is restrict their fructose and increase that other mineral that I mentioned called potassium. Potassium is something that our body has evolved with way back in the past. We used to eat a lot more of it than we do now. And so as long as you have higher amounts of potassium, you can handle a lot more sodium. And it just happens that more potassium lowers blood pressure very, very nicely. So when we talk about blood pressure, we're not necessarily avoiding fructose. What do? We avoid salt diets, right? So very simply, just understanding these mechanisms, you can very easily control your blood pressure by increasing potassium, getting rid of the sugars, especially fructose. And as far as sodium goes, as long as you have enough potassium, you have like a 2-to-1 ratio, twice as much potassium as sodium, you're going to be totally fine. Another thing about uric acid, it's involved with the immune inflammation reaction, as it can help fight off infections, things like that. In the past, we used that as a survival mechanism. Nowadays, if we have too much uric acid, we get inflammation throughout our bodies, especially in the big toe, and that's called gout. Now, another really interesting survival thing is just storage of fat and the storage of glucose as glycogen, right? Glycogen is stored glucose. What's interesting about this as it relates to water, in times of survival when we didn't have enough water, believe it or not, as we burned our fat, glycogen can make water. In fact, just a little over 1 gram, like 1.1 gram of fat, when it's burned, produces 1 gram of water, which is interesting. So that's going to be a survival mechanism to help against dehydration, but also glycogen. So if you envision these string of glucose molecules connected together, they're connected together with a lot of water. So for every 1 gram of glucose that you burn, you release 3.5 grams of water. So you're releasing a lot of available water when you burn up this glucose as glycogen. Now, in the past, when we consumed fructose, it always came with a bunch of antioxidants because we ate fruit. And of course, the fruit wasn't as sweet as it is now, but fruit generally has antioxidants. And antioxidants protect against the oxidative damage of the fructose. It gets rid of the complications of just high sugar. This is why a diabetic will have much less problems if they actually also have the antioxidants connected with that sugar versus the refined sugars where you're just doing high fructose corn syrup and you're drinking it. Related to antioxidants, I want to just touch on vitamin C, which is interesting. Vitamin C has a very similar chemistry to both glucose and fructose. And so the more glucose and fructose you consume, the more vitamin C is required. One is it helps protect the immune system. Another is it helps to get rid of oxidative damage from the high glucose. Vitamin C can even inhibit the burning of fat as well. So it can actually help you survive because it slows down to a certain degree fat oxidation or fat burning. Now, what I'm not saying is avoiding vitamin C because it's going to help you lose weight. That's not how it works. The point I'm making is the vitamin C in the fruit is protective against that fructose. So when you study metabolic syndrome and you look at what they say is the cause, they said overeating, it could be obesity, stress, a lack of exercise, age. And when you really understand this, you're going to be less susceptible to just going, oh, let's just treat each part of this with a different drug, which makes no sense whatsoever. So if you have problems with sodium, if you have problems with your midsection, if you have problems with high blood pressure, if you have problems with uric acid, fructose is what you need to avoid, and in all forms as well. Now, if you want a complete diet to know exactly what to eat to reverse a lot of the problems that you might have, I put that video up right here. Check it out.
OK，我们今天看了2个，一个是告诉我们怎么样选择油，另外一个就是我们的代谢问题。它这里面说
I've
到，
done a lot of videos on
我看到一个关键点呢，就在说到，比如说我们的那个盐，因为有些人做菜，他就说少不了放盐，那个盐不放，好像那菜就不好吃。但是盐如果是盐吃多了，盐的成分是钠，它会在身体里面留住，它会让水分留住。然后呢，那要怎么样来平衡呢？他说你增加钾，就是盐里面的成分是钠，那你吃跟它一样比例的钾，那个钾就是我们的蔬菜那些，那你的盐钠跟钾的比例它平衡了，那个盐的伤害，盐对身体造成伤害 它就被挤出去了。就说那个钾它能把钠挤出去，所以这样去达到一个平衡。达到一个平衡的时候，我们没有受到伤害。所以当吃到了盐的那种比较咸的食物，我们的盐吃那么多的时候，那我们要通过钾来达到一个平衡。所以吃的咸的，非要放盐的那种菜的话，一定要相应的蔬菜在旁边，就是含钾比较高的那种蔬菜啊，来平衡。这是我们平常日常生活中经常遇到，天天都在面对的一个问题哈。清灯师兄说高血压避免多吃果糖。你爸现在吃的是自己打的3七粉，蜂蜜和三餐一起。他这里说的就是说那个蜂蜜啊，他蜂蜜前面说到过，他说好像是蜂蜜是果糖嘛。等一下我再看一看，我再看看这个，再看看这个视频。这个果糖它是说到了，其他糖呢可以其他代谢掉，在其他任何器官都能记住代谢掉，但是这个果糖只有在肝脏里面去代谢吧，因为这个我们就是从代谢问题了，从代谢问题延伸出来的。那我们吃进去以后怎么样代谢，怎么样排出去？那果糖啊，只有通过肝脏去代谢，所以那样子的话就增加肝脏的负担。如果是说肝脏的功能不全，那我们就问题就出来了，它会在那里代谢不掉啊，在身体里面就代谢不掉，然后那就说到了好多的疾病就出来了，那个肚子那里就大起来了，然后呢，高血压啦，然后高血糖啦，这些就出来了。好，这里我点开了一个，顺便把这个看完，这个只有几分钟，看看我们身体里面。
New Poise Advanced Odor Control Liners provide 95% odor reduction. It takes poise.
怎么看到这里
我们
了？
日本福岛核灾时候，其实那时候
Over 40% of the population is deficient in magnesium. You're about to find out that a magnesium deficiency can create huge problems for your health. The influence of magnesium in your heart, if you're deficient, you can end up with high blood pressure. Magnesium has everything to do with the relaxation of arteries, muscles, smooth muscles. So if you're deficient in magnesium, you're going to have a little more calcium and your arteries are going to get rigid and you'll have a tendency to have high blood pressure. Another common problem with the heart is arrhythmias, okay? The pacemaker of your heart is neurological, but it connects to the muscle. And you actually have 4 pacemakers, which are little cells that have this rhythmic beat into the heart. But that pacemaker is mostly dependent on the electrolyte magnesium. And because magnesium is involved with nerve and muscle, you can end up with tetany or twitching or any type of abnormal relaxation or contraction of a muscle. And this is why the number 1 cause of a leg cramp or a foot cramp is a magnesium deficiency. Magnesium doesn't just have to do with muscles, though, or nerves. It's involved in over 350 different enzyme or biochemical pathways, some involving the production of energy. That's why the number 1 sign of a magnesium deficiency is fatigue, because if you don't have magnesium, you can't make energy. You also have magnesium influence over insulin. For example, if you're deficient, you're way more at risk of getting diabetes and developing insulin resistance. And so if you have insulin resistance or you're pre-diabetic or a diabetic, you must make sure that you have enough magnesium to fix that. Even your mood is influenced by magnesium. People who are depressed are nearly always deficient in magnesium. Another really good biomarker or indication that you're low in magnesium is C-reactive protein. It's an inflammatory biomarker, and without magnesium, it's very, very difficult to get rid of inflammation. And so there's a big magnesium immune system relationship. The RDAs, or the required amounts of magnesium, range anywhere between 300 to about 750 milligrams. If a person has some type of degenerative chronic disorder or a heart problem or diabetes or high blood pressure, the need for magnesium goes way up. And so if you're just operating off of these smaller amounts, you're going to have a hard time fixing these problems. I think there's two ways that we are deficient in magnesium. Number one, we lose a lot of magnesium when we process foods, when we refine foods. And most people live on refined foods, especially children who don't consume enough magnesium. So even though we're overfed, we're definitely undernourished. The other big challenge with magnesium deficiencies is identifying magnesium deficiency or testing for a magnesium deficiency. If you're using the blood to measure magnesium, you will never find a deficiency. I'm talking about 99% of all your magnesium is actually located inside the cell, not in the blood. Out of all the total magnesium you have, only 1% of it is in the blood. So you really have to understand the input dietarily of magnesium, as well as things that can deplete magnesium. And if we take a look at foods high in potassium, really we want to look at one molecule, and that is chlorophyll. That's the green stuff in plants. And at the heart of chlorophyll, you have magnesium. The chemistry of chlorophyll is very similar to your own blood, with one difference. With blood, you have iron. With chlorophyll, you have magnesium. And with an average person, especially in America, only consuming 1 cup of vegetables per day, you can see the problem. And that's for adults. I don't know many children that consume any vegetables. So we have this input, this dietary input that we need to focus on, but also other things can deplete you of magnesium. The big one is sugar, and the second one is refined carbohydrates. The more sugar, the more refined carbohydrates you eat, the more magnesium you need to metabolize or deal with those calories. If you have diarrhea, you lose a lot of magnesium. If you're on a diuretic, you will lose magnesium. If you're on an antibiotic, you can lose magnesium. And when you drink alcohol, you lose magnesium. And even as we age, we store less magnesium in certain tissues. There's also a really important connection between your ability to absorb vitamin D and magnesium. You're also going to have a hard time absorbing B vitamins without magnesium. Magnesium is involved in certain transporters in certain things in your body. So one reason why you might be B deficient or vitamin D deficient is you just don't have enough magnesium in the diet. Magnesium also is involved in helping you keep your cortisol stress on the low side. This is why magnesium is important in sleeping, right? Because you're deficient in magnesium and you have all these muscle cramps and you're stressed out, you're not going to get a good night's sleep. Ideally, you want to get your magnesium from your food. So that would be consuming a lot of dark leafy green vegetables. If you wanted to take a supplement, I would recommend the following types of magnesium. These are way more bioavailable than other sources, okay? And I'm talking about magnesium citrate or magnesium lactate or magnesium glycinate or magnesium aspartate or even magnesium gluconate. So I think now you have a greater appreciation for magnesium, but the other mineral that is equally important is potassium. And if you haven't seen this video, I put it up right here. Check it out.
今天时间也差不多了，我们看完这3个视频时间差不多了。反正这3个视频里面都指向一个，就是精制碳水，还有一个就是欧米伽6的油。这三种是我们日常生活的食物中接触的最多的。然后呢，我们要补充多的那个钙镁。平常说我们身体如果是说以前就是说缺钙会出清，这里其实它是这样子，镁如果是你缺镁的时候，那钙也吸收不了啊，所以它就出筋。有的时候我们的那个小腿啊，或者是说手啊抓不住东西啊，出筋啊，真的就缺这些。这些的话呢，这些就说缺这些，我们出筋，有的时候出筋的时候啊，是说 出处，还有就是那个肌肉会出处，就好像是那种出处跟出经是两个吧？啊，出处是肌肉，肌肉在出处，还有就是心脏。他这讲到，就是说缺镁的时候，那个心脏里面的那些肌肉缩呀、起搏呀，他说会影响到那里的。然后，所以这个缺镁这个的话，它会影响到心脏的那种触动起搏。那心脏里面，他说是个小起搏器啊，如果缺镁，会影响到那里的肌无力，让肌肉的那种出动呢，它没有力气。然后，我们的那个肌肉有的时候会出处，就是小腿啊，或者是说一些然后让你疲劳，然后很难消炎，这是缺镁。然后那镁又在哪里呢？在食物里面，在那个叶绿叶蔬菜里面。所以我们吃的蔬菜，我们吃蔬菜够不够？如果是说我们吃太多，前面说到过，我们吃太多的那个糖跟那个精致碳水，我们都需要相应的吃这么多的绿叶蔬菜来达到一个平衡。那我们的食物结构，所以我们的食物结构里面，如果是说一定要吃这些精致碳水，或者是说一定要吃到加盐比较多的食物的话，我们相应的那个蔬菜，这个绿叶蔬菜一定要跟上，这个比例一定要跟上。这样子的话呢，你就是说又满足了嘴巴，最少让身体不要那么难受。然后那就是慢慢去达到一个平衡了。但是呢，他还是不建议，就是博格医生讲，我不建议多吃糖，我不建议吃这个，他没有说强制，他只是说不建议哈，这样子能让你这个身体更舒服。但是有的时候我们会去想会去想这种精致的食物跟那个糖是免不了的。然后那现在要避开那个欧米伽6的油，确实挺难的。因为你看刚才比较一下，一个是鸡蛋，我们先不是去说那个草饲的牛肉啊跟谷饲的牛肉，它就光一个鸡蛋，你看那个鸡蛋比较，那个鸡蛋如果是谷饲的那个鸡蛋里面的欧米伽6跟欧米伽3的那个比例啊，一个是9点多吧，一个是1点多，反正就是说放养的吃草那种鸡蛋，你要吃到里面的那个欧米伽6就很少，欧米伽3比较多。但如果是说你是吃那种谷饲的，因那个就是我们说的饲料谷饲的那种牛肉的话，你看它的那个欧米伽6是19.9:1，就是欧米伽6跟欧米伽3的比例是19.9:1，相当于就是20倍了。但是是草饲的，那草饲的好像是才1点多吧，是1点多还是3点多？那这样子的，从一些数据比较下来，然后我们就知道，就是好像这2块肉没什么区别，但是它里面的成分真的完全不一样了。你吃一口那个草饲的，跟吃一口那个谷饲的完全不一样的。吃谷饲的，也许你通过你烹饪的那个方法你的厨艺很好，你能把它做的很可口，然后你吃起来的时候甚至很好卖。如果是说你是开餐厅的话，你甚至很好卖，因为好嘛，因为做的厨艺很好嘛，很可口，让人吃了还想吃。但是对身体确实不好就是说你吃这一口，你那个欧米伽6欧米伽6是20倍跟欧米伽3的那个比例。所以这些里面的成分我们不能用，就是说我们的口感或者是说看上去差不多那来比较它真的通过数据比较以后，我们要健康的饮食最少吃的不痛苦吧。那这些也是要学习，我们需要学习的真的是太多了。那时间差不多了，然后呢还剩下几分钟，因为这些就是说这些学习呢，我们不是1天2天的，我们是一个长期的。那我们昨天呢是否分享了一个学习音乐的网站？我现在剩下几分钟，我们来分享一下昨天人家教我们怎么样唱歌，唱那个罗刹海市的歌
Help kids get back to playtime with Nurofen for children for up to 8-hour fever relief. Help raise up to $135,000 for CareFlight when you buy Nurofen for children.
是从头开始听呢，还是说就我们听他一点点怎么样唱，教我们怎么唱？
One of Australia's most satisfied customers.
3段还要不要唱？请告诉我要唱吗？要唱我们唱完它好吗？来。红楼赤闹的梅花枝，玉手几万金上去，如是那从来没当生就黑。我们开始要上课了，逐字逐句来教。那就我们再来一遍吗？准备好了吗？莎莎带大家说唱啊，不是唱，我们变成说唱了啊！来。相逢两外有情人面过七重月交海，山村的黄鹂只为那有一条月球河，这水流过云南。云南家的穿错马路，有魂灵啊，两耳望见相同，会从海边先传递。那又要城头是哎呀，大家有点点赞好吗？欢迎你们。小花儿叫马青云，疯子手提汤画下的字句，只为他人在郑州我风大浪，落有心有落日。听着落茶落雨长天涯，都要离去，三更早起到明儿四城，把声要真情，茶红尘满花城。玉袖几万金香旗，可是那从来没当儿生就黑。也是个脏东西，那马虎知道他是头，他有了是一只心，有花中。哎呀，第3段还要不要唱？请告诉我要唱吗？要唱我们唱完啊！来。红楼赤闹的梅花枝，玉袖几万金上去，可是那从来没当儿生就黑。这个脏东西， 又来了几个黑粉啊，没关系的，欢迎小黑黑们啊，没有他们咱们就不欢乐了。孩子有心情有好歹，白羊孩也有钱要有坏，女子为好夫全都好。为上这西边的后更有老板，生而为眼手马不驴有鸟鸡，到底马不是驴还是驴是有鸟鸡？哪里是鸡？哪个鸡是驴了？鸡是驴，哪里是鸡？那马不有鸟，是我们人问。最后一段我加重了啊，今天上午讲的加重的地方给大家加重了，这样的话好唱一点啊。来，怎么样？能不能开始？咱们开始第一段，今天我带大家逐字逐句来教啊。那么先一句一句教，好的，请你先把灯牌和关注点好，我们要上课了啊。不要着急，莎莎带大家清唱一遍，我们让清唱唱出伴奏的感觉，好吗？准备开始，来吸气，走了啊，空两拍去唱，冲。落茶过向东梁外，六千里啊，我起床月叫海，三寸的黄泥地，只为那有一条一丘河啊，河水流过沟沟营啊，当当当当，一二三四，狗狗应当家的茬儿，唤作马虎。
Get the latest and the greatest on Disney Plus. When the stakes are this high.
十里花场啊，有闻名啊，两耳傍肩三空比，未曾抬眼先转顶，每日多我里来我。以为自己是知己，那马虎不知道它是一头驴，那有鸟不知道它是一只鸡。狗栏从来般高呀，自古公公好为民哎呀！来，第一段咱们清唱，大家觉得好听吗？好听吧，好听，打在公屏上啊。来，第一段可以了吗？好，那么第一段我们开始来学习了啊。在学习的时候，同学们，咱们要注意啊，注意每一句话中间都有隐藏的音，莎莎带大家来学会它。还需要再带一遍清唱吗？如果需要的话，咱们打一个要。第一段我再带一遍清唱，好不好？好不好？感谢大家啊，谢谢小礼物，谢谢石慧姐姐。第一段要不要再来一遍清唱了？需要的话把要打在公屏上，再带一遍，好吗？来，准备开始。那我们再来一遍。好，来，那就再来一遍了。准备好啊，跟我一起，空两拍再唱，空落。好，来一遍，准备吸气，空落茶过向东梁。
好，今天时间差不多了，你看啊，它这个视频呢有1个多小时，1个半小时了，就这一首歌，它在教，确实是一句一句逐字的教。然后这里面你看它那个，有一个人这样子说的，他说啊，这姑娘真的很有才华了，唱的1级棒，就连我这个潮州老头哦，也要跟他学，太好听了。那你看下面的评论，这些人都说他真的教的挺好。这首歌他教1个半小时啊，他在教我们里面就是说那些诀窍点呢，一点一点全部教出来。好，我们有时间就可以跟着学习了啊。今天的时间差不多了，我们就 今天的课结束了，明天同一时间我们继续。好，要链接好，那我把链接发到。OK，那我们明天见。